Welcome to Duel-Logic, where we dive deep into the questions that divide us. I'm here with Captain Zara Reyes, Judge J.B. Buchanan, Marcus Johnson, and AI researcher Priya Sharma. Last week, U.S. Special Forces captured Venezuelan President Maduro in an operation that's got the world split down the middle, some calling it justice, others calling it imperialism. Zara, you've operated in complex situations overseas. When does intervention cross the line from rescue mission to conquest?
Look, the line isn't philosophical, it's practical. You cross it the moment you're doing something for interests and dressing it up as humanitarian. I've seen both. In Haiti, we were there because people were drowning. In other places, the stated mission and the real mission didn't match, and locals knew it immediately. They always know. So the real question isn't whether we take down Maduro. Clearly we can. It's whether the Venezuelan people actually asked us to, or whether we decided for them that we know what's best for their country.
Captain Reyes just said something crucial. The locals always know. I see this play out in Chicago all the time, when outside money or policy comes in without asking the community first. We had a development deal 5 years back where the city decided what our neighborhood needed, and it took us months to undo the damage. Now imagine that power dynamic, but with military intervention and a whole country's future on the line. That's not justice. That's someone else playing chess with people's lives.
You're both circling around something the Constitution actually addresses. The War Powers Resolution exists precisely because we recognize that unilateral executive action, however well-intentioned, corrodes the legitimacy of the entire enterprise. The framers understood that consent matters, and I'd argue it matters doubly when we're talking about overthrowing foreign governments. Without congressional authorization, without Venezuelan civil society actually petitioning us for intervention, we're not executing justice. We're exercising raw power and calling it law.
I respect that framing, Judge. Where I push back, though, the War Powers Resolution is about government's accountability to Congress, which matters. But here's the tactical problem. Waiting for perfect legal authorization while people are getting disappeared in detention centers, that's a luxury argument. The Venezuelans suffering under Maduro didn't get a congressional vote either. The real test isn't the paperwork. It's whether we're willing to stick around and actually rebuild, or if we're just removing a problem and leaving chaos behind.
Captain, I hear you on the urgency. Disappearances are real and they matter, but that's exactly the trap. With all due respect, we'll fix it after is what every empire says before it doesn't. I've watched neighborhoods get saved by outside intervention, and 20 years later we're still waiting for the rebuild, while the people who made the decision moved on to the next crisis.
Priya, you've been quiet, but I'm curious, when you hear this debate about intervention versus abandonment, what does that look like from a systems perspective?
Here's what strikes me. You're all describing a system with no feedback loops, and that's the real failure. Marcus, you're right that outside intervention without local buy-in creates perverse incentives. But Captain, you're also right that waiting for perfect consensus while people suffer is its own kind of abandonment. The question I'd ask is, what would it look like if we actually listened to Venezuelan civil society first, let them define what intervention means, and built accountability structures into the operation instead of hoping they happen after?
Now, that's a framework I can work with. Priya, you're describing what we'd call procedural legitimacy, and it's the missing piece everyone glosses over. The hard truth is that consulting Venezuelan civil society we act isn't a delay tactic. It's the only thing that separates an intervention from an occupation. Captain Reyes is right that urgency matters, but Marcus has the historical record, and the Constitution for that matter, seeing that bypassing process to save time has never, in my experience, produced better outcomes.
Priya's onto something real there. Feedback loops, accountability built in from day one. That I can work with. But Judge, here's where theory meets ground truth. When you're talking to Venezuelan civil society right now, half of them are terrified to speak openly, and the other half have already fled the country. So who exactly are we consulting, and how do we know they actually represent the people still suffering? The procedural legitimacy argument assumes we have time to build consensus. Sometimes we don't.
That's the honest question, Captain. Who do we listen to?
And I think that's exactly why we can't skip the process. You're right that fear silences people, but moving unilaterally doesn't fix that. It just means we're guessing about what Venezuelans actually want while we're already boots on the ground. The underground resistance networks, the diaspora organizing, the church leaders still there, they exist, and they're the ones who live with the consequences long after we leave.
Zara, I can see you want to push back on something Marcus just said about consulting resistance networks. What's your concern there?
Marcus, resistance networks tell you what they want us to do, not what's actually sustainable once we're gone. I've worked with plenty of groups that begged for air support, weapons, direct intervention, because in the moment, that's the lifeline. But 6 months later, when we're not there, and they're facing retaliation from whoever fills the power vacuum, they're the ones paying the price, not us sitting in Washington. The real question isn't whether to consult them. Of course we should. It's whether we're honest with them up front about what we can actually commit to long term.
That's a fascinating tension, Zara, between what people desperately need in the moment versus what we can actually deliver. Priya, from a systems design perspective, is there a way to structure interventions so that gap doesn't become a betrayal?
You're describing a commitment device problem, and actually this is solvable. What if the intervention itself was structured around that both sides agree to up front? Like, we commit to specific security benchmarks, institutional capacity building, timeline for a transition to local leadership, and if we're not hitting those, we publicly acknowledge failure and adjust or exit. Captain, your concern about false promises disappears if the promises are concrete and monitored, not vague intentions.
Priya, I like where your head's at. Measurable milestones beat vague promises every time. But here's what I've seen. Those benchmarks look good on paper until political winds shift back home, and suddenly the metrics get redefined, or the mission gets quietly extended. The real accountability has to come from inside Venezuela, not from Washington audits, which means we need Venezuelan institutions strong enough to say no to us before we ever arrive.
You've identified the fatal flaw in Priya's otherwise elegant system, and I say that with respect for the rigor of her thinking. The problem is that measurable milestones only constrain power if there's genuine political will to be constrained, and history suggests that evaporates the moment circumstances change back home. Marcus is absolutely right that Venezuelan institutions have to be the check on us, not the other way around, which means we'd need to build those institutions before intervention, not after, and that's generational work, not a military operation.
JB's right about the political will problem. I've seen it happen. But here's what bothers me about the build institutions first argument. It sounds wise until you're explaining to someone being tortured why we're investing in capacity building instead of extracting them. Priya's milestones aren't perfect, but they're honest about the trade-off in a way most policy papers never are. Okay, but practically speaking, if we go in with measurable benchmarks, who enforces them when Washington gets bored? That's the real accountability gap nobody's solved yet.
Marcus, you're shaking your head. What if we flipped this completely and gave Venezuelan institutions the power to shut us down?
Now you're talking about something real. Give a transitional Venezuelan government, one that actually represents people across the political spectrum, the contractual right to terminate the intervention. And suddenly, we're not occupiers, we're guests. Captain Reyes just said it. The enforcement cap closes when the people we're supposedly helping have genuine power to send us home, not just advisory boards that get ignored.
There it is. Marcus just articulated what the Constitution was actually trying to prevent, a government that can't be held accountable to the people it claims to serve. A termination clause with real teeth transforms the entire power dynamic. And honestly, it's the only framework that squares Zara's moral urgency with institutional restraint. But we're describing something radical here, essentially telling Congress and the executive that Venezuelan consent supersedes our strategic interests, which no administration has willingly accepted since the Monroe Doctrine.
Thanks to Captain Reyes, Judge Buchanan, Marcus, and Priya for wrestling with the hardest question in foreign policy. The breakthrough here might be flipping the script entirely. What if the people we're saving had the power to fire us? That's Duel-Logic. We'll see you next time.